It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here today for a lunchtime talk. It's the first of the lunchtime talks here at the Bard Graduate Center this year that's being delivered by one of our research fellows. And so it's a pleasure to welcome Fabio Barry, also Amanda Wunder, who's here today, from whom we'll be hearing next week. Professor Barry is a professor in the art history department at Stanford University, having taught previously in the Department of Art History at St. Andrews University. His training is originally as a classicist. His work as a doctoral student was on marble and its different forms in the ancient and medieval worlds. He's worked extensively on Rome, has a piece, in fact, in the current Art Bulletin on the attempt to synthesize colors and colored marble in France and in Rome in particular in the 17th and 18th centuries. He's working here at the Bard Graduate Center on questions having to do with stone and sculpture. He reports a strong desire to be an early modernist that is foiled constantly by his love of marble and his fascination and explorations in the way in which marble has been used in different ways in different times and in different places. And the talk today, which has also changed its title, now takes us back and then forward in the long view on the way in which the treatment of walls has moved between stone and the depiction of stone from, as we see here, Knossos to Rome. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Fabio Barry. He'll speak from the podium and then take questions from the table. Welcome.
Great. Thanks very much. And thank you. I'm very happy to be here in general. Very happy to be a visiting fellow here in the centre of New York, in tranquil office with a good library collection and lots of interesting and nice people to talk to. And I'd like to thank you all for making that possible, and I'd like to thank Itai, who put the idea in my head in the first place. Now, yes, this isn't the talk I was going to give. I was going to give one about Alexandria, but this is a little more visually fulfilling than that one. And this is also really the sort of prequel as well. So, let me just see if this thing works. Yes. By the mid-1st century AD, the homes of the Roman super-rich had become so encrusted in coloured marbles, actually also mother of pearl, gold leaf, hard stones, gems, you name it, that the encyclopedist and natural scientist Pliny the Elder lamented that fresco had been ousted. It was now eclipsed, and coepimus lapide depingere, we have begun to paint in stone. Now, Pliny's obituary of painting was somewhat premature, of course, but he was also woefully, what is that? He was woefully anachronistic. Just close it off. Let's hope this doesn't come back. He was woefully anachronistic in his dating, in accusing his peers of painting in stone, because the prize for this invention should instead go to the Minoan painters who had invented the medium of buon fresco 2 millennia earlier on the island of Crete. Now, just in case you are rusty or forgotten, this technique, fresco, entails covering a masonry wall with a rough cast of plaster, the intonaco, onto which a layer of much finer lime plaster is troweled and smoothed to cover as large an area as one can paint in a day. And this is a trial piece I did on a bathroom tile one summer. It's when I had my light bulb moment, actually, which led to this whole talk and book chapter. after preparing a one-to-one scale drawing of the composition, what we call a cartoon, the painter normally traces its outlines through the paper onto the fresh plaster with a stylus, or pricks them. Oh. Thank you. Or pricks them with a needle and then sets to work painting. Now, the pigments must be diluted in lime water before they are daubed into the plaster, into which they sink, such that pigment and plaster dry to bond in an insoluble amalgam. And the fine residue of pigment particles remaining on the surface dries into a protective crystalline mesh known as the lime crust, and that can be buffed and polished after the plaster has completely dried. There's in fact quite a famous Gallo-Roman relief from probably the late 1st, early 2nd century AD that shows painters and plasterers working side by side, executing every step in the process simultaneously. Now, because fresco is so associated with the Renaissance and with the Italian Renaissance in particular, few people, I suppose, imagine that the technique is as old as it is, and that it was actually invented on Crete by artisans of the Minoan civilization somewhere around the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. The most famous frescoes in the palace at Knossos on Crete include scenes like this Minoan rodeo with fearless toreadors somersaulting over charging bulls. Yet this painting dates somewhere between, well, very roughly, 1700 BC and the destruction of the palace, which is apparently somewhere around 1450 BC. So in other words, it's 2 or 3 centuries after the actual invention of the medium. The earliest datable fragments of fresco, instead, which Sir Arthur Evans discovered in tiny fragments, were decorated with wavy patterns that scholars have either deemed abstract, and that's decorative, or conceded represent coloured stones, and they have therefore judged them mimetic. Now, because Minoan figurative painting arrives so much later, its eventual emergence is normally taken to witness the graduation of mural painting from craft to art, from primitive to sophisticated, from an artisanal way of ornamenting a wall to the birth of an artistic consciousness. Where fresco recognizably simulates stone, it is an easy but unwarranted assumption that any simulation obviated the difficulty and expense of quarrying and fixing the real thing. And this is a peculiar assumption for a number of reasons. First of all, the local gypsum that was used to clad floors, stairs, benches, and dados was actually pretty easy to cut and soft to smooth. And here's a fairly rare example of a room on Crete where any of this is left in situ, the so-called Queen's Megaron at the villa at Villa Palace at Phaistos. And actually, it's not even clear to me that the use of gypsum revetment predates the use of fresco anyway. So the sequence for this may be completely wrong, assuming that one thing is an imitation of the other. Another reason is that since the Neolithic, late Neolithic period, the Minoans had devoted great skill and endless hours to carving out vessels, vases, and beakers from all manner of much harder stones, from limestone, from marble, from breccias, basalt, calcite, diorite, obsidian, schist, serpentine, and so on. It's also the case that the stone that Minoan painters represent hardly represents the soapy-looking gypsum that survives. So if you just look at the famous throne room here on the right, look at the difference between the painted dado there. So I'm talking about that area there, which of course is very restored. The whole thing was repainted when the Knossos was excavated, but there are substantial fragments of this survive. So it's pretty accurate as a reconstruction. Just compare that with that sort of kaleidoscopic veining to the benches below, the floor, and the throne itself, which is made from the most veined gypsum you can get on Crete, which is called Balatina gypsum, just in case you're wondering. So this painted stone has far more affinities with the luxury vessels the Minoans imported from Egypt and the coloured stones that they were taking at the same time from mainland Greece. And in this sense, the invention of fresco as a synthetic coloured stone belongs to a much wider range of material synthesis in the Bronze Age of stones and gems that allowed artisans not only to emulate nature, but improve upon it. And this synthesis includes the invention of glass, the idea of even glazing earthenware, of faience, and in fact even firing bricks, because when you fire bricks you make something that's like a stone as well. But the most impressive example is just round the corner in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's this marbled glass goblet, probably made in what is now northeastern Iraq, and exported to Egypt in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. It's a convention to say that it's marbled, because the men who made it had never seen marbles, streaky or not, and they were therefore either thinking of hard stones like agate, or, in my opinion, creating a new mineral from their own imaginations. And in this case, they were doing it by fusing nuggets of glass with finely powdered quartz, rolling it into sandwiches, then slicing it into these marble patterns, and then marveling it and flame polishing it till it acquired the sort of consistency of a precious stone. Now, in this respect, because there is a tremendous amount of literature about these things, it seems to have gone completely unnoticed that a much earlier Sumerian epic, something written between around 2000 and 1700 BC, already celebrates this kind of technological achievement when it tells the story of a king, Enmerkar of Uruk, who, under the inspiration of the artificer god Enki, fulfills the challenge of creating a regal scepter of no known substance by pouring a gluey compound into a hollow reed mould, which he breaks apart once it is hardened to reveal something that is neither wood nor metal nor stone. It's a completely new material, they say. Now, specialists currently hypothesize that Minoan builders were the people who first developed lime mortar to waterproof the joints between the stones in external walls, which joints they maybe then painted, and this was the origin of fresco. Well, I mean, that may well have been a stage in the medium's evolution. It might have even been its accidental origin. But there's plenty of consilient evidence that fresco actually consciously was devised to synthesize a material as hard and impermeable as stone, but with an even broader range of coloration and veining than in the stones available to them. And this was achieved by dissembling and reconstituting the elements the makers saw already in nature. Now, in reassessing the material origins of Minoan fresco, it's necessary to argue 3 points, and these are kind of 3 points I'm going to continue along. First, that fresco is devised precisely in order to synthesize coloured stone, as I've said. Secondly, that over time, the embodied image materialized within the wall, not on it. And thirdly, that such painting would finally arise from the wall as corporeal relief a relief that also came to be articulated as architecture. Now, in fact, Minoan ceramicists had already been cloning stone in clay for some centuries before fresco appeared, beginning with the vessels now known as vasiliki ware. Cups and beakers, and again the dating, you can deduct 200 years from these things. It's so difficult to be precise, but somewhere around 2600 to 2200 BC, cups and beakers were brushed and speckled with amorphous patterns that immediately recall the veining of genuine stone vessels, sometimes found in the same cache. And here's another example. So on the left, again, vasiliki ware beaker, and on the right, a small bowl actually carved out of a piece of alabaster. In the next generation of Minoan pottery, so-called Camaras ware, whose output is actually coeval with the invention of development of fresco, Minoan painters also came to correct the unruly veining of the stones they aped into pleasing geometrical conventions like this that would actually last for centuries. Now, all these concerted simulations suggest that the development of fresco was neither accidental nor simply utilitarian. Their Egyptian colleagues, meanwhile, were completely unaffected by the Minoan discovery of fresco and continued simply to paint tempera, that's a pigment in a binding agent of glue, honey, milk, most commonly egg, straight onto walls covered with dried gypsum plaster, so what we call today plaster of Paris. Well, where I come from they do anyway, I don't know what they call it here. The resulting painting was an emulsion, a vulnerable skin that may chip and flake over the years. Now, by contrast, in fresco, the coloration, of course, is as inherent and petrified as that which the Minoans cherished in coloured stones. And all the raw materials of painting were products of the earth around them. Paint did not come in tubes, and plaster did not come in sacks. The pigments were coloured earths, sometimes even the blues, rocks and clays that were naturally tinted by the mineral oxides they contained, predominantly iron, but also manganese. And painters prospected the land for these earths, digging boulders out of the hillsides, crushing, washing, grinding and drying them, then rewashing them to increase the intensity of their colour, or burning them so that their yellows turned to reds. For these artists, used to the daily grind of mineral into pigments between stone mullers and stone slabs, the idea of painting in stone was more than an idle metaphor. The same goes for plaster. The lime needed for fresco plaster was itself limestone or calcium carbonate that had been calcined, meaning it had been baked in an oven or on top of a huge bonfire until it decomposed into lime, so calcium oxide, which was then pulverized and slaked with water in a violent exothermic reaction that transformed it into quicklime for the mortar and plaster. Now, it was a brutal and elemental transaction with nature. It's a battle of earth, fire, and water with the remnants consumed by the air. And the final fresco itself, of course, is another case of just add water, for no other binder was necessary for the pigments except the fabric of the plaster itself, because fresco was, as I said, an amalgam. Now, to sum up, in fresco pigment, and so in fresco the pigment, and so the image too, is in the wall, not on it, and so earthy are all its constituents that fresco represents the earliest example of painting in stone. Fresco was therefore a means of synthesizing nature rather than simply colouring plaster, materializing stone by reconstituting it from its basic elements. And Fresco enjoyed, as a result, an essential potential to create a secondary reality by substantiating something that would otherwise remain only depicted. And of course, it can be molded as well. It doesn't just remain a plane. So later ideas of illusionism, and this has been pointed out also in an essay by Seth Estrin, who's written about Minoan fresco. Later ideas of illusionism are really abstraneous to Minoan wall painting. There's no picture plane. There's therefore no illusionistic window onto a virtual reality apart from the viewer. And a nice example that reconciles all these observations of the processes and significance of the media and reveals how the materiality of the wall rewards its pictorial representation is this room. It's on the island of Thera, now known as Santorini, which is a tourist hellhole. Apparently, I've never been there. In the Cyclades, where Minoan or Minoan-trained painters painted a domestic room with the earliest pure landscape in Western art. And its subject is the natural world. It's a fecundating image of spring or summer with flowering lilies on the mountain slopes and the courtship of swallows overhead. There's no perspective, of course, nor any sort of diminution of the components to intimate spatial depth. By the same token, there is no background. The scene is not framed in any way. Instead, the earth presses on the wall and swallows up the room at its most appropriate situation on the ground floor. Created in the space of years between a violent earthquake and the volcanic eruption that would eventually bury the town, the painters could not have been more aware of the chthonic force of nature in action. They striped the mountains they painted with bands of greenish ochre, terracotta red, and bluey grey paint, which could stand for clay, pumice or ash, even the lava produced by the floral eruptions that are depicted here. Putting the final cataclysm of Thera out of mind, one can more serenely say that it's a geological image of the paint itself, the pigments that the earth offers up to the prospecting painter, the basic conditions of nature. Now, the most extraordinary example of such bounty is something like the rainbow dune known as the Seven Earths in the Mauritius, which result from the decomposition of volcanic rock into clay and then soil tinted by iron and aluminium. And there are similarly heavily mineralized mountains in China and Peru and other parts of the world. Now, the stratigraphy of Thera, which of course exploded, I mean the whole center of the island is missing from this enormous terminal eruption they had. The stratigraphy of Thera, of course, is no less remarkable, even if the palette is hardly so kaleidoscopic. Now, the Minoan concern with presencing substance emerges from another fresco, this time at Knossos, where undulating lines separate and surround naturalistic partridges. These lines have been interpreted as rivers or just decorative patterns, but the pottery we saw earlier suggests that they actually represent stone veining, further emphasizing how the image is consubstantial with the support. In another example, a stone rises like an amoeba in water to become objectified as it slips over the ruled border to surface in our realm as a slab. And you can see, obviously, these frescoes are recomposed from fragments, but none of the semi-complete Cretan frescoes are actually flat. So there's a relief quality to them always. It's not just a thing floating up, it's actually coming to the surface. It's emerging. So this concern with presencing, with vitalizing the image, also meant that, as I've said, much Minoan painting is rarely flat, it's frequently molded, and it would eventually give birth to molded images in relief. And the trajectory is completed, I think, when the figure eventually emerges from the wall, as in this famous charging bull, also from the palace at Knossos. Now, from an early date, fresco spread to floors. At first it was simply the mortar between real slabs that was coloured. But because fresco was hard enough to tread underfoot, you weren't going to wipe off any of the paint with your feet. Eventually, smooth floors were painted all over, and about 80 of these are known from palaces and mansions on Bronze Age Crete. The capacity that fresco afforded to synthesize the earth also meant that painters could create their own stones when nature was found wanting. And a really stunning example of that comes from all places, eastern Syria. Now I say of all places because it was believed for most of the 20th century that the art of mural painting must have been brought west to Crete from Sumer or Assyria, and therefore fresco technique with it. But in the last 20, 25 years, I suppose, archaeologists have instead realized that itinerant Minoan painters took their skills east, as becomes evident from sites in Syria, Turkey, Israel, and latterly Egypt. And in the palace of Zimri Lim at Mari, which you can see is in far eastern modern Syria, it was Minoan painters who frescoed the upper face of this dais, possibly for a king to stand on, in reds, yellows, and bluey-green ochres to materialize a completely imaginary stone inspired by agate or Egyptian alabaster, perhaps. Well, I'd just like to say one thing about this. The most recent discussions of this, because it's cropped up again in literature, all talk about it being a monochrome. But none of the people who've written about it have realized that it's a black and white photo taken in 1923. It's actually colored. In any case, so the material envisioned here is completely alien to the lithic environment of the palace, because Mari is on the silty banks of the Euphrates, and it's surrounded by desert. So to have a stone like this, which is a synthetic stone, remember, I mean, you might as well have had a meteorite in the courtyard for the kind of shock effect it would have had. And this taste here may have been inherited from Old Kingdom Egyptians, who used a harder, glossier, more saturated alabaster. I keep calling it alabaster. Of course, I'm supposed to call it travertine or calcite, but let's just call it alabaster. That's what people have been calling it for centuries, since Pliny, in fact. The more saturated alabaster to make precious vessels, which they would export to Crete and also to around the Middle East and also mainland Greece. And in fact, in another room, in another house at Akrotiri on the island of Thera, not only did the painters create dados of faux alabaster all around the room, but they painted just such vases in the jambs of a deep window niche where the sun would have illumined them best and presumably conjured up the translucency for which these vessels must have been prized, because this alabaster was a solar, heavenly material, a fundamental reason it became a luxury item in Egypt. I mean, it seemed to be a stone that had soaked up the sun, beneficial rays of the sun, and the largest quarries of it were a place called Hatnub, which means mansion of the sun, in fact. The remaining decorations in the room, so this thing down here, represent the Ikrion, or the ox-hide bridge of a ship, even allowing the possibility that this house belonged to a maritime trader, one who might have brought Egyptian and Minoan artifacts and raw materials to Thera, and maybe even the painters to paint the walls. And just in case you're wondering, you can see it's actually up there. Do you see that? In that jamb of the window that this piece of fresco was painted. Now, at a Canaanite palace in Tel Kabri in Galilee in Israel, Minoan painters would fashion the whole floor of the throne room as a checkerboard of facsimile gypsum or onyx, and more examples keep coming to light. The taste for such pavements, even outdoors, however, reached its acme in Mycenaean Greece in the palaces of Homeric fame, places like Mycenaean and Pylos, but also Tiryns and Glar. And when these floors were first uncovered in the late 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th, the pattern grids were thought to represent textiles or carpets, although it's now long understood that the variegated lines and dots are conventions for stone veining and mottling, a bit like the Vasiliki where I showed you at the beginning. Even so, the floors may combine evocations of stone and textiles side by side, together with marine animals, octopuses, that sort of thing, composing an assemblage that completely supersedes any possible reality. And all these frescoes were also very highly polished, like the best quality stones, and accentuating their affinity with them through luminosity, but also decanting at the same time some of their earthbound nature. Piet de Jong's imaginative reconstruction does some justice to the original appearance of these throne rooms of the Megaron at Pylos, the type of hall in which Telemachus blurts out in the Odyssey, "Can you believe your eyes? The murmuring hall, how luminous it is. This is the way the court of Zeus must be upon Olympus." What a wonder. And if you seek parallels more familiar to the modern world, then we could maybe view this environment through the lens of magic realism in 20th century Latin American literature, or more favourite of mine, you can imagine yourself a spectator here, as akin to an avatar in the virtual worlds of the internet. It's in the Megaron. In the Megaron, it was the only pavement. It was only the pavement really that gave any solid footing in mundane reality, and the shimmering surface of this made even that footing seem precarious. Oh, we don't have time. Traces of the origins of Minoan fresco as a synthesis of coloured stone appear in the ball leapers we saw earlier. And if you look at the boundary of this, these scales here, overlapping scales, probably represent a kind of stone that's called conglomerate. But they are meant to represent a stone in any case. And this sort of thing doesn't get much mention in the art historical text, obviously, because it literally lies at the margin of this, much more kind of furious representation in the middle here. When you look at it, however, you realise it's not just a frame. It's not just a circumdelineation of a sea. These lines actually continue off screen, left and right, and that's because they would have been part of a sort of border that you find, for example, in this room, famous room, the Hall of the Double Axes at the palace in Knossos. It's again using, to make a border like this in imitation stone, is again kind of materializing something, this time what lies beneath the fresco, because the walls of these palaces were half timbered. They're cages of wood in which rubble was packed with clay, but the rigidity of the wall was established by this hidden structural frame. And it's been regularly a retrospective projection of modernist expectations and tendencies to think of this sort of X-ray transparency in terms of structural honesty. Of course, it's an invention of, when was structural honesty invented? I don't know, 1920? No, a bit earlier, I guess. 1830? Really? Who's first says that? Pugin. Oh. Have you just been teaching that? All right, 1830. Thanks for correcting me. But it's still modern. This is 2000 BC. But it's perhaps more accurate to think of this representation here as a sort of petrification of the wood within the wall. And in fact, when this occluded framework emerges from the wall, left and right here, it's in the shape of these very hefty beams and posts. Not only this, but the distinctive triple banding of these Minoan frescoes came to reflect the introduction of orthostates, so slabs that were placed upright from ground level, which had the practical purpose of being kick zones for the basis of the wall, but symbolically, of course, were the place where showed the place where the palace was built on a firm foundation, and then maybe by extension, this is pure speculation, the state planting its feet solidly on the ground, etc., etc., etc. The role of fresco in materializing revetments and masonry did not halt here in Mycenaean Greece. It has a long afterlife. Across the Mediterranean in the classical period, and then from Egypt to Rome in the Hellenistic period, a means of decorating walls with marbleized stucco developed, which was only supplanted by real revetment in the 1st century AD, as Pliny moaned at the outset. The earliest example we actually know of a wall being marbled is apparently the palace of King Mausolus at Halicarnassus, which has never been excavated, so there's not a trace of it left. And even then, the marble only went so far up the wall. The rest of it was beautifully polished stucco, so fine it was like glass, apparently. So you can imagine what this would have looked like. Would have been very similar to this wall excavated at Pella in Macedon, ancient Macedon, in northeastern Greece, from a building imaginatively called the House of the Plasterworks, from the sort of late 3rd century BC. And you can see this is actually, this is quite an extraordinary height this survived. Or something like that, where there are better examples on Delos, the island of Delos. And those survived because there was abundant local stone, so the walls weren't built of brick. So they're surviving to a great height. So you have some idea of what these would have looked like, and this kind of plastering goes under the name generally of the masonry style. And the illusion, again, is painted, but it's not pictorial, for the architecture here is still arising as relief, and only that remnant at the top, which is coloured blue, suggests that there could be a sky beyond this. Now, in time, the colour schemes and the moulded relief of such walls spread to the Italian peninsula, where they were reincarnated in the Roman idiom very well known as the first style. And this is a nice example, House of Samnites, detail of the kind of faux breccia painted in the fresco there. And then over there, Lawrence Alma-Tadema sketching the House of Sallust in Pompeii. Completely irrelevant, but I thought I'd throw it in. So this practice probably made its way into Italy from probably, who knows, this is speculation again, but probably from the Greek colonies in southern Italy, in Magna Graecia, and from whom it would have been adopted by the Etruscans in central and northern Italy, although, as you can see here, in a rather flattened form. And the reason to believe this is things like this, the back chamber of this tomb, dated to the late 4th century BC, which suggests, and the tomb is arranged as a dining room, as a triclinium, suggesting that perhaps this is how Etruscan dining rooms were decorated, long-lost houses. And then, in sort of continuity with this, 2 centuries later, in now Romanized Etruria, you'll see something as fantastic as this loggia of a house at Populonia, where the technique really hasn't changed that much since Knossos, the details have. From a brilliant white stucco, particularly hard and white stucco, the painters here conjured up the illusion of at least 20 different alabasters and coloured marbles that could have hardly been available on the open market. I mean, they maybe carried samples around in a bag or something, but these weren't travelling up and down Italy at the time. Now, 100 years after the arrival of such decorations, Vitruvius will explain them, and he's looking at things like this, by saying, quote, "The ancients who first used polished finishings originally imitated the varieties and arrangements of marble veneers." And most people take him at his word on this, right? This must be true. But in reality, there's not a scrap of evidence for the prototypes he postulated to justify his a posteriori rationalization. And what I mean by that is that before the advent of spoliar construction in late antiquity, there just simply weren't walls made of heterogeneous blocks of vari-coloured marbles. There's not a single example I can think of, right? And surely in now centuries of archaeological excavation, some relic, however paltry, would have been found. It seems no coincidence to me that the only text to mention such walls of this sort, is Plato's Critias, which describes a never-never-land Atlantis. Nor is there any evidence, interestingly enough, for coloured marble revetment, because none of that's been found either. I can think of maybe 2 slabs of grey stone orthostate, which were found in one room of a palace in Pergamon, and that's it. And it's very unlikely there would have been anyway, because the vast majority of domestic buildings, palaces included, with extremely few exceptions, above the footings and maybe a socle zone in stone, everything else is built in mud brick, fired brick if you're lucky, right? And these walls simply aren't strong enough to bear the loads of several tons, which is what slab after slab of marble amounts to. And even then, even if this were true, when you actually examine these things, I'm not going to show you images, don't worry, you'll find blocks that turn corners, you'll find the margins of blocks are different colours to the bosses, the parts that project, none of which is possible, of course, in real construction if these things are supposed to be blocks. And it's also true that this isn't just some kind of very pretty wallpaper, which is often suggested. It's an economic substitute. So, for example, if we look back at the house of the plasterworks at Pella, the vermilion there is made actually out of cinnabar, which was absolutely one of the most expensive minerals circulating in the Mediterranean, and earned the castigation of Pliny. So, in summation, the first of 2 summations there, all this make-believe construction here is not an image of what was, but what could be. And even though these painted reliefs can pass themselves off as plausible construction, they have no true reference in reality. They are simulacra, they are copies without an original. And this reminds me of Aristotle's most problematic definition of mimesis in the Poetics, that mimesis of a hero is mimesis of the best a hero can be, rather than a historical personage contained by temporal events. So the representation of the wall is, in one sense, a heroization of the possibilities, or the material possibilities of the wall, taking the building blocks of real construction, the author state, what went above it, and so on, and lifting that into another kind of dimension of creation and imagination. And it's within this context, and I really am in the home straight here now, that the absent marble appears in all its painterly potential. Because the marble they thought of from the get-go as being a kind of frozen painting, right? And even if they hadn't just looked at it and conceived it as that way, making fresco, of course, for centuries would have simply reinforced this or brought to bear this perception. And so if you look closely, I went there about 3 weeks ago, specifically just to take this damn photo. If you look very, very closely at this wall here, in there, you'll find there's this peculiar animal here. It took me a fair amount of time to realise it's actually a dolphin grabbing an octopus. And of course, this is a long way inland, this painting. And this is the earliest example I know. There are quite a few of these I've been collecting in that. This is the earliest one I've found. And you think, well, the painter, maybe he was bored out of his mind, painting imitation stone. Thought nobody will notice this, or there is at eye level. But I also think more seriously that he was probably influenced by the experience of looking at fossiliferous stones, which of course obviously contain marine life. And then it's the material, right? The idea that you are synthesizing all the while nature, making your own stone when you paint in fresco, allows you the possibility to create fossils as well of a kind that don't exist. And you'll find these all over the place. So next time you're in the Met, go and look in the Bosco Reale sections, and you'll see this maple leaf here appearing out of granite. And I think the only person who's written about it is the person who wrote the catalogue on this, not at the Met, before I get into trouble, who said it must have been an accident. As they say in Italy. Anyway, and so the extraordinary idea that here you'd have an image, of course, of a natural object, a maple leaf appearing in granite, which is one of the stones which is least likely to give rise to images, because there's no veins at knot and form profiles and so on. So this is kind of pointillism, avant la lettre in a way. And then I think more sophisticated ideas of this sort of birthing images would be a wall on Delos, where you can see you've got your imitation orthostates and blocks and whatever, and a meander. And then there are a great many of these different walls where they introduce scenes, sometimes from John in the middle. In this particular case, which is Ariadne and Hypnos, I think, you can see these figures here painted in cream and white over a dark red background, what would be called monochromata, according to Pliny, I believe, which seems to me is a way of painting that's probably inspired by cameo, actually. So an illusion which is consonant with the kind of lithic environment of the wall around it. And I don't want to go on about that, I just wanted to show you it. Now, by Vitruvius's day, when he comes to say, look, all this stuff is just based on, it's just copies of marble walls that you can find somewhere. The Minoan palaces, Mycenaean palaces were all in ruin, and the Minoan ones were completely buried under debris. So he had no idea of the origins of fresco. And by his time, the idea that a mural was mimetic was an idea you took for granted. Hence the idea that if you have a faux marble first style wall, that it must have some kind of real world prototype. Now, by Vitruvius's day, the first style had also had given way to the second style, wherein you have very highly polished wall frame, a series of frames framing perspectival illusions of a theatrical architecture, framing still more fantasy architecture, and receding beyond the wall plane. And the difference between this sort of painting and the Minoan creations is the difference really between a civilization, the Minoan one, that kind of melds nature and its representation into one sort of perhaps animistic continuum, and another that is now influenced by the science of things and optics. And notwithstanding that I've just said that, it still manages to cling on to its material origins, because I can't think of a single second style painting where you really actually get a view outside the room. And the usual kind of evolutionary narrative of Roman painting is to go from being hemmed in by first style walls, and then this kind of beginning of the emancipation of the viewer as people pick away at the virtual surface, and the wall opens up to you. But actually, when you look at a second style wall, beyond the wall, you're just looking at more wall. Right? So it's representing itself. And in the same period, or predating it in Greece by a long time, you get more and more use of columns, or actual marble columns beginning to be used in Roman houses following a Greek precedent. This becomes an object of criticism of conspicuous consumption, and so on. So in a way, what you've got here, I think, is not actually a kind of lightening up of the wall, but ever more representation of the stone, right? A sort of a rematerialization of the wall, in which illusionism is more of a byproduct, actually. The culmination, though, of this sort of optical estrangement from substance and a growing devotion to objecthood is a fresco like this in the Villa Farnesina, Rome, from the mid-1st century BC. The relatively shallow recession of the virtual wall here acts to make a stage for a variety of represented paintings. You have classical Greek panels in tempera or encaustic, with or without shutters to protect them, fresco representing fresco painting, even small-scale sculpture. So the wall now, the elision of space has led to a deficit in substance, and the wall has become a pinacoteca, an art gallery, an art world. Thank you.
Well, Professor Barry makes his way to this end of the table. We can compose ourselves, and the floor is now open for questions.
Just to start, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. I mean, the obvious question would be, and you giving us this, I don't know how to call it, marble Vollen not build Vollen, but marble Vollen of the development of non-marble depictions. And it's the question of where is culture? Because
Culture or sculpture?
Yeah, culture.
Okay.
Because you are describing a kind of a 2,000-year development of a manner of depicting marblesque or some form of wall decoration that is fresco, but it doesn't have any relations to any culture. That is to say, the culture itself constantly changes, but the story continues. Hence the build volume. So the critique or the question will be, where does culture fit into all of this? And where does change in culture fit into all of this?
Well, I addressed that slightly at the end.
Yeah.
That's what I was,
Yeah.
But it's not, for the purposes of a talk, right, and to write a document, text, I put together an arc of history, right? I'm not claiming there's a kind of consistency between Minoan Greece and first century Rome. What I'm trying to say really is that there's the material aspect of the painting, which hasn't been completely ignored, for sure, but hasn't been sufficiently, I think, taken into consideration. And once you simply displace the emphasis away from just looking at this as sort of disembodied visual illusion, which is the way, is the predominant but not sole way mural painting, ancient mural painting is spoken of, it's mimetic and illusory and so on, and concentrate on the implications of the material, then you can construct a story like this. So the cultural changes aren't necessary for that narrative, actually.
I could just follow up. I think, in a way, you started out hinting at an answer to Itai's question, because at the beginning of the talk, you showed pictures of vases and pots, and suggested that the wall painters were following from what the pots were doing, and you mentioned also cameos, and then you dropped these other forms. So I'm wondering if you told the history of those other forms, would that in fact, in parallel with the walls, would that be a way of coming towards an answer to Itai's question? Because pots take you into one other realm, and jewelry takes you into a still different realm, and if you put all those together, you might be able to come to Itai's question.
Well, certainly as far as origins go, I mean, so my concern is really just the traditional narrative that people painting the gaps between stones in the traditional fresco painting may be reductive, right? And there may be an artistic or Marmorwollen, whatever you intention, Kunstwollen anyway, intention here. So that's why I begin with the pots, and obviously it's all it can only ever be speculation, but it seems to me that that's an argument that can be made from the materials and the objects themselves, and even from a position of cultural ignorance, actually. I think there is obviously a big cultural change. I think that happens with I discern here an influence of optics. Right? I think, but also what I didn't really talk about is the ancient stage must be influential, but I presume, because the evidence is so scanty, I presume that the optical dimension is something that's put into the mix in Alexandria, being the centre of science in the Greek world, which most people seem to think that generations of this painting, second style, quite possibly derived from experiments made there. So it seems to me, as in terms of really having very little evidence to base it on, that's a kind of reasonable assumption to make. Then there's also a question of it used to be said, and this is what Estrin's essay is quite good at explaining. It used to be said that Minoan painting was sort of naturalistic, that there was a kind of sort of naive honesty to it, or something. And that was because of, partly because of applying criteria to it that one would use about much later Western painting. So what you replace that with, I don't know, because we don't in the end know sufficiently enough about Minoan religion and culture in real detail to talk about to have a very accurate view of it. We know they didn't have temples. However, they did have peak sanctuaries and they worshipped in caves, things like that. Because there are a lot of caves on Crete and there are a lot of ex-votos in them. And so that's known. So that gives you a few clues. I mean, it's a kind of particular kind of material engagement they have with their world, right? Which is not mediated even by what we would call architecture now at that point. And from this one can draw, I think one can, not conclusions, but one can take some faltering steps forward. I don't know if that actually answers in any way. Thank you.
Yeah, I wonder whether you might be able to infer, and this is something that people who work on in the Renaissance get upset about, but I'm going to do it with the Renaissance in the ancient world, all of those wonderful frescoes in the 15th century that represent what we all assume are marbleized surfaces. Well, we call them marbleized.
Castagno.
I'm thinking exactly Castagno, yeah. and others that are, pale imitations of Castagno that become kind of stock and trade of interior decoration. This is like the wall decoration class that's never been taught at the PGC. They've been digging that for years. That's another story. I'll tell you about it. But I mean that was. Did that come out of nowhere?
No, it's still alive, I think. And I mean, some of the issues about certainly the paintedness of the stone and so on, those are quite apparently there in Fra Angelico. And what's his name was written about this extensively 25 years ago. Henri, sorry, I'm blanking on his name.
Did you Uberman?
Did you Uberman? Thank you. Castagno is a bit of a particular case because I think you're referring to the refectory of Santa Apollonia, no? And that's a representation of the Last Supper, and then you have particularly kind of stormy, dramatic stones behind. And Jesus and that other guy, whose name begins with J.
I just wonder if there's a direct. I mean, it's evoking an ancient interior. Obviously, that's the idea of that fresco.
Yes.
And is that because there was a sense that from literature that this is the way, I mean, all the texts that you were quoting about ancient palaces and all, were these things that also were painters and humanists were aware of those texts, and so the decoration is mimicking the texts, or is there a continuous craft tradition of?
Well, there's not a continuous tradition of making marble palaces, because that basically stops in the West anyway, in early antiquity, because they run out of the raw materials, and then they start spoliating it, and they do keep sort of stealing slabs from one building and putting them on another. So that happens. But there were plenty of ruins. They didn't actually need the text necessarily. Given the standing buildings in Stanford, old churches, in fact, some of which were converted halls from palaces like Santa Andrea in Catarabia in Rome, or Cosmos and Damian in the Forum, and so on. So there were like enough examples. And then there are lots of genres. So the Annunciation, is another one where you get a lot of marbles. And yes, on one side it's an archaeological exercise in imagining the ancient house, but on the other, the stones also are pregnant with meaning. So if it's one of the common things for the Annunciation must be that the image appears in the stone the same way Christ appears in the womb at the moment of the archangel appearance. So there are lots of, there's no overall text that will apply to each thing again and again through history. Obviously, there's no settled signification, and shifting like morphes and so on. But there's this essential matter of there you are, essential matter. What is this thing? And what is its status? And this is the first kind of range of representation. It begins with the materials before there's any figuration. I think we will agree probably on that. But
thank you. Yeah, I just wondered, does your arc story finish in the late Roman period, or do you then extend it to see if there are, once the representational mode has been established, are there moments of reversion to the poor representational throughout the sort of late antiquity and ages?
There are moments, not to Minoan, because nobody, before Evans, we're in the 19th century, nobody had ever seen it. And a lot of the Roman wall painting wasn't available until Pompeii and Herculaneum, Campanian towns are excavated. I mean, there was painting that could be seen, but not the large amounts we have available to us. So there was a sort of a deficit of evidence. But there are moments, certainly in the history of fresco painting, where you see people aware of it as a plastic rather than a pictorial form. Even Titian. There's a rarely shown, I should have stuck it in, but there's a rarely shown fresco by Titian where he molds the entire forearm. It's It's actually in relief. It's the very early Titian frescoes. And if you look at it in raking light, the arm is sticking out of the wall in a fresco painting. And in that case, that's a particular, I imagine, part of a theoretical mindset where people are thinking and talking way too much about the differences and similarities between painting and sculpture. So that sort of arises out of that. It's in Venice of all places. But, so there's that kind of thing. Is that
Well, I just wondered in your own project how far you were going to carry it.
Oh, I go to the 18th century. I actually started in the 18th century and went backwards. I am an early modernist, there you are.
And on that note, given respect to the clock, we'll need to stop here. Those who want to stay on and ask some more questions certainly can do so. And it remains just for us to thank our speaker for this trip deep into the past and back towards the present.